Welcome back. Last episode, I spent an inordinate amount of time griping about how much of a pain in the butt americium production was going to be, solved the problem with rampant unregulated capitalism, and called it good. If all things go well, we might even be able to use some of it today, courtesy of the energy hatches I am very, very slowly working on. This immediately brings up another fun problem. I ran out of space for recipes on my assembling machine. Oops. To my great and personal disappointment, you cannot link multiple peer-to-peer inputs to a single output, which prevents me from having banks of recipes stored in an entirely unrelated area that magically beam resources to the assembler, but there are other options. The best one is to do the same subnet nonsense that I'm using with great effect on my mega chemical reactors, but parallelized, which easily nets me 4 times the recipe capacity without requiring me to do anything silly, like apply brainpower to the situation. Even better, since there are no in-circuit recipe conflicts, I don't even need to add blocking cards, so this setup is plug and play. Until I run out of channels on a circuit's frequency subnet, at which point I will have beaten the game, died of old age, or rage quit, so it won't be an issue. While we're on the topic of fixing fun problems, assembly line recipes. For reasons beyond my comprehension, certain recipes require duplicate, non-full stacks of the same item to craft. For example, a Lapatronic Energy Orb Cluster requires 2 stacks of 36 Lapatron chips. Period. The machine will ignore any attempt to craft the orb with a stack of 64 and a stack of 8, despite this making zero difference whatsoever in the cost or processing requirements of the recipe. My most generous theory as to why this was implemented this way was that it was to force people to make the longer versions of the assembly line without hard-coding the requirement into the machine itself. But that assumes anyone who made it to Louvre is somehow dumb enough to think that they're saving time by not building the full version of anything, which leaves me with my alternative theory, which is whoever designed the recipe just thought they looked better that way and gave no thought to the logistical implications whatsoever. And boy howdy, is there a lot of circumstantial evidence for that one floating around. The solution is to name the duplicated item stacks something so they don't stack using a forming press and a name mold. By the way, it isn't even a hard problem, it's just annoying, because now every time you get one of these janky recipes, you have to drop what you're doing, go over to the forming press, and create samples of the renamed items to program the ME system. This happens, yeah, like 3 times since I've gotten the assembly lines. So it is possible that I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, but at the same time, why? Anyway, enough stalling. I need scalable power production, and I need it now. I gave some serious, and I do mean very serious thought to multiplying my vac nuke design by a factor of 4 and calling it good, but past a certain point my avoidance of traditional energy production options in favor of mean power stops being funny and starts being sad, and I kind of blew past that point 3 episodes ago, so I think it is time, for once in my life, to play something straight. The first step to producing 100% as Greg intended straight power is, drumroll please, redesigning and upgrading my alloy blast smelters to handle context-dependent crafting. Yeah, it'll make sense in a moment. Once my alloy blast smelters are redesigned so that they will no longer randomly make unexpected alloys as one of their features, I can start the bulk production of magical Gregtech++ mystery fluid alloy nonsense. This fluid alloy nonsense enables the creation of an Utupu Tunari, also known as a dehydrator or a tall EBF, which I can then feed Rare Earth 3 sourced from my infinite collection of basically everything, and then refeed it the byproducts of that process. This whole system was supposed to produce lanthanum, which is used as a component for radiation-proof plating, but unfortunately for me, it does not produce anywhere near enough, so I ended up biting the bullet, going AFK for a night, and paying the 42,000 iridium price tag for the alternative recipe. I needed to do something about the dehydrator and alloy blast furnace situation anyway, so this is honestly fine, but still, just don't bother getting the plates with lanthanum. It is a waste of time. Meanwhile, with that doomed-to-fail project running in the background, I turn my attention to other important progression tasks, such as my rare and deviant quest to engage in a behavior known as touching grass, while my UV assembly machine spends 55 seconds making each individual coil block. Fun. After a good 10 minutes of getting really into touching topiary, I come to my senses and realize it is faster to create the multi-block assembler than it will be to wait on the single block version, so I suck it up and do that instead. I don't even bother automating it. The thing is going to be responsible for optimistically 3 crafting jobs each tier, but it does them 200% faster than the single block one, and I can't do anything without upgraded coils, so those are a priority right now. Finishing the coils unlocks the superconducting option for UV, which itself unlocks UV energy hatches. That seems important. I'll make 16. You know, eventually. No rush or anything. It totally isn't like the entirety of my game state progression is based on the construction of this one specific bill or anything. So, you remember that weird bit in the last video where I spent several hours running around my base, upgrading all the energy hatches and cleaning out all the terrible wiring decisions I had to make to support machines with different voltage requirements? Yeah, that nice clean wiring design sure lasted a period of time describable as non-zero, didn't it? In other news, my assembly machine can now consume more energy than the combined demand of my entire base 2 episodes ago, which is the final upgrade required to start mass production of more upgrades. I've learned from my mistakes from the last time I upgraded my everything grid. There will be no more piecemealing it. We are doing full cold turkey upgrades this time around. 24 hours of AFK to pay off that particularly optimistic production bill later, and believe me, I will be doing something about that once I have energy to spare, and I am left with a bunch of parts for several duplicates of a machine called an active transformer, stacks upon stacks of superconducting UV cables, and almost all the things I need for my new power generation solution. The one thing I'm missing is just a squick of bedrockium. My tech tree of stupidity has evolved to the point where I can make the bee to produce bedrockium without too much nonsense, thank you, Mutatron. So this isn't the issue that it once was, but I'm still not going to be using it for power, because plasma is lame. I like to think of this instead as the game's way of telling me that no matter what, I will never be able to escape bee breeding, and that in the end, it all comes back to bees. If it wasn't obvious yet, my next power solution is going to be the Nequata generator multiblock. When burning Mark I Nequata fuel and catalyzed appropriately with atomic separation catalyst and gelid cryothium, each generator produces roughly 80 amps of UV power, which is 6 times the current output of my entire base. That sounds lovely. Let's make 2. They're small. Now I have to figure out how to fuel them. Most of their requirements are things I can't explicitly make yet, so the necessary and obvious solution is to fix that. Gelid cryothium is already in production, but I have better things to do with my processing capacity, so I opt to make bees do most of the work for me instead on that. Their automation is weird, but it's not going to be that way for long, so who cares, it works. Atomic separation catalyst is a bog standard mix of random stuff I have plenty of, so all I need to do for that is program the production line for it so that fluid export buses on the reactors can keep me topped up. And also spend 30 minutes draining my ME system of the several 100,000 buckets of hydrogen that I accidentally collected because I forgot to turn off an electrolyzer before I went AFK for the night. It turns out that when the ME output hatches say they have infinite capacity, they really truly mean they have infinite capacity. And I know this is being patched in later versions, and I'm honestly glad because the property was more annoying than it was useful. But in my honest opinion, they really should never have had this capability at all because they're emulating an output hatch and fluid import bus combo, and that doesn't really have any fluid storage capacity to speak of. Nequata Fuel Mark I is the tricky part. The production of this stuff doesn't require anything new, but it does need distillation, cracking, and 3 dedicated Mark II doughnuts to produce fast enough to run the generators at full speed, which is pretty unlikely to happen for a bit, but you know, future-proofing. Ironically enough, this means that my refusal to use plasma and petroleum products has culminated in a system that wrapped all the way back around to using something that is effectively plasma and petroleum at the same time, so there's really no escaping it, is there? Mark I fuel eats fluorine voraciously, so I also blow a really concerning number of ignoble princesses, forcing through the bee tree up to fluorine bees. At some point, I'm probably going to throw my hands up and throw the towel in and hammer out the rest of the accessible species, but that would take a whole lot of time I don't really feel like spending, so we're going to keep piecemealing it. Each new species also seems to eat half a dozen princesses from mutation damage before I can isolate the traits I want to, but it isn't a war crime if you can make infinite amounts of them, so I don't care. Now that, in principle, I can keep these things running for a bit, let's talk power logistics. As previously mentioned, these multis output roughly 80 amps of UV power. This is too much power, because the largest dynamo I can make outputs only 64 amps, and I don't want to waste the extra 16 amps. The multis also only support one dynamo per multi, so it is simply too much power for me to output and transfer with any dynamo I can make right now. This is where lasers come in. The documentation on how they work is pretty garbage, but they're basically just the same as a multi-amp energy hatch and dynamo. The executive summary is as follows. Laser source hatches are just thick dynamos. Laser target hatches are just thick energy hatches, and there is only one kind of wire used for any laser voltage or amperage combination that is called a laser vacuum pipe. The things also let you move around up to 1,000,000 amps of power if you feel like it, so they're pretty strong. The caveat to this is that the energy hatches and vacuum pipe have to be built in a straight line and all be the same color. The color's easy because you smack them with a roller brush or something, but the straight line requirement is a bit annoying to work around, especially when your base does weird things like make considerations for aesthetic appeal instead of building floating rows of ugly machine bricks half a kilometer long. My solution to this, which is for once the intended solution, is to route the reactor's power output into a supercapacitor for throttling control, export the power via laser, and then bounce it between a bunch of Tech active transformer multiblocks, again via laser. These multis can accept and output any voltage of conventional or laser EU power and are compatible with both conventional and laser energy hatches and dynamos. And wow, I feel like a used car salesman right now. So once power gets into one of them, I can freely convert it however I want. Think of them as the Rosetta Stone of voltage tiers. Supercapacitors have this same property, so I could have used those, but the Tech transformers are way cheaper to spam out, especially when you can assemble 2/3 of them with your leftover Louvre tier energy hatches instead of the expected casing block. By slamming down some UV 64 amp dynamo hatches on them, in addition to the laser routing, I can then convert laser amps to EU amps and spaghetti my base up from there like normal. Incidentally, this project means I finally have an excuse to use some of the void putty I made back when I was still experimenting with Botania. Instead of being lame and crafting a spray can or color applicator and having to laboriously refill them like a pleb, I can just use a paint roller and repair it with putty before the paint runs out. I bet the lasers will love it. This small utility definitely justifies all the time I spent making 10,000 units of this stuff. Now that I finally have my power grid upgraded enough to support the tier switch, it's time to play the oh-so-fun game of let's swap out every energy hatch in my base and see what breaks because the machines need esoteric structural upgrades to accept the additional power. Believe me, this is a massive improvement over the previous game of how on earth do I get power to these things that I started the episode out on, even if it took 11 minutes for you and 2.5 days for me to get here. Yikes. All this talk of power raises an interesting question, which is, what do I do with my old vac nuke design? It's still running my EBFs due to a shortage of UV energy hatches, but that will not be the case for long. I could dismantle it, and given that the thing is one laggy redstone op from toaster bathtubbing most of my base, you would rightly conclude that this is the sane option. I instead rewire it into a brand new passive production system consisting of 16 ZPM tier volcanuses that will form the backbone of my new system of passive production, or PP for short. Certain high-tier materials like neutronium and superconducting alloys take a really obnoxiously long time to smelt and their bills clog the general use pipeline, but with the power of PP, I will never need to worry about this again, because I can now queue up a generous bill of, say, 30,000 neutronium, and it will happily cook away in the background without even drawing from the main power grid. When switching over the main EBF line to its new UV power supply, I also indulge myself by taking a metaphorical flamethrower and an actual wrench to its terrible cable management. You might think that, given the weeks of time that I put into this game, I would have found a way of arranging cables that doesn't cause brain hemorrhaging every time I have to interact with them, but you would be wrong. The new setup got rid of the power line spaghetti and introduced novel quality of life changes, such as being able to access all of the input hatches to clear out clogs. And until this was a thing, I was physically deconstructing the EBF every time it jammed, so not my brightest moment there. The only thing left to upgrade is my mega chemical reactors, which were put on the back burner by dint of requiring over 4,000 ingots of osmium, which is a little bit pricey, but okay, to finish their upgrades. For this, we have osmium bees, I guess. It all comes back to bees. This upgrade is well worth it though, because now that I have laser power arrays going, the real limit to how much energy I can stuff in them is how much energy I feel like producing, which is a lot. Mega chemical reactors have perfect overclocking, which means there is no penalty for over-providing power for a low-tier recipe, and therefore there is no real incentive to throttle a machine's power consumption for efficiency reasons. Not that I bother doing that anyway. For now, I'm sticking with 4 amps UV because I don't want to overdraw my generators, but that is not going to be a case for long. So cool, we are now 15-ish minutes into the episode and are now only just ready to stop playing Interior Home Decorator Simulator 2100 Ultra Pedantic mode and start playing New Horizons. That bodes well. The first step to actual tech progression is to upgrade my crystal circuit production. How I do this is largely irrelevant and involves a bunch of synthetic garnet made using an alloy of cerium and lutetium, but the end result is that I can now mostly move away from using the traditional crystal chips, which, may I point out, are still being made using liquefied Europeans produced entirely by monazite refinement lines that have not stopped running since I made them back in late IV. Eat your heart out, intended progression mechanics. And that's actually the only upgrade I can make to crystal circuit production. The rest of the circuit upgrades are going to come from biocircuits, which I kind of need to get done with yesterday because they're blocking all the other fun stuff this tier unlocks. So, step 1. Play with eggs. Normally, you can't make an omelet without cracking a few, but in this pack, you can't make computer chips. Sure, eggs, plus a bunch of bioengineering tech I've already progressed unusually far along in during my quest for liquid space herpes, gives me egg juice bacteria, which I need to infect a bacteria vat with in order to produce raw growth catalyst medium, also known as uncooked egg boogers, using the aforementioned space herpes juice, salt, calcium, agar, and that pink slop they make chicken nuggets out of. It would be substantially more annoying if it weren't for the fact that I already had to do this process in reverse to get the space herpes sample in the first place, because, Mars kind of doesn't exist in this universe. So this is mostly me maintaining clean quest progression in case the rewards end up mattering for some reason. Cooking the egg boogers then gives me growth catalyst, the last ingredient needed to make the next tier of circuit board. The quest book tries to justify this novelty by saying that it is an unusual way of making circuit boards, but I just press the button on my Magic Do Everything iPad and they appear in my warehouse the same way everything else does, so what does it know? The complete board is easy to produce the same way, but that is going to change here in a moment because for all my snarkiness, I really don't want to have to pay a Louvre tier pump and an IV tier sensor each time I make 16 of these things. To resolve this minor inconvenience, I need a certain machine. This machine, and oh wowee, you aren't gonna see this coming, is another donut. Are you serious? These things aren't even hard to produce at this point because they're basically just the game telling me to engage with the real world for half an hour or something. This donut gets to make duranium, the precursor to tritanium, which it turns out I will eventually need for my next multiblock, and unlike for tritanium, the quest book neglected to mention I might want to start stocking up on it. So it's a good thing I spend all my machine processing time reading flavor text, isn't it? Like, I get it, you like fusion reactors. I now have 11 of them, and this is without using them for power production. Can we stop with the bit, please? It's time to stop the bit. For now, though, in a rare turn of events, I don't have to wait overnight for Mystery Material of the Week to process, so without further verbosity, the PCB factory. It makes printed circuit boards cheaper, and that's really it. The fun part is how it works, because as multi-block structures though, this one is a little bit unusual. For starters, it actually looks like the thing it pretends to be, which is kind of a bit of a brain bender given the normal aesthetic up to this point has been Grug's first big shiny box. There has been a push to redesign a lot of the multis to make them look better, especially in the up patches of this version that I'm on right now, but this one is the first that really leans hard into it. It also has modular subparts as optional upgrades, which sounds intimidating until you realize that they work via magic telepathy powers, are required, and make no real difference to the function of the machine whatsoever other than providing a more logical way of upgrading it. For those of you who have somehow been clinging to the hope that I will make my place of residence not look like I dropped the illegitimate child of steampunk and Star Trek down a flight of stairs, I regret to inform you that the deviation in construction style is very much permanent. I have all but given up trying to make the place look decent. I would love to put everything in a nice organized box for aesthetic reasons, but the fact of the matter is, this pack wants one thing, and that thing is biblical levels of butt-ugly Technicolor factory gore, and in the relationship between me and New Horizons, I'm not exactly the one holding the riding crop. And this is where easy tech progression ends. It was nice while it lasted. For you see, I have encountered a stumbling block. And that stumbling block is you. You matter. This wonderful purple fluid has been rebalanced into obscurity to such an extent that despite theoretically being able to produce nearly any base material in the game, it is phenomenally awful at producing anything, to the point where even an indium shortage was not enough to convince me to start producing it. Well, 250 millibuckets is now a hard requirement for every single biocircuit I want to produce, so guess who gets to stop putting that off? Yeah, me. This sucks unusually hard because the multi-block UU production and recycler builds require something called a quantum singularity. It's made with a 1% chance from an unknown particle and some duranium in a compact cyclotron, also known as a purple doughnut. The unknown particles are produced, primarily, from 3 7.5% chance rolls of a hydrogen ion in a purple doughnut. The hydrogen ions are produced from 9 5% rolls in, you guessed it, another purple doughnut. Welcome to the casino minigame section of Gregtech New Horizons. The only way to win is to play so much that you bludgeon the game senseless with the law of large numbers, using doughnuts. Simply fantastic. But hey, you know what's better than building one purple doughnut? Two. Because why not, am I right? Power isn't an issue anymore. Resource demands aren't an issue anymore, except for oxygen gas, weirdly enough. The only resource worth conserving at this point is player time, so let loose the hounds of spam, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry, you thought I was only going to make two? Please. I think we will start with half a dozen, overclock the daylights out of them, and then move on from there. As with disconcertingly many things that I've been doing since Luve unlocked, the solution to the cyclotron problem, if you can even call it that, is queue up a bunch of junk in your magical AE2 craft everything machine, spend 5 minutes wiring it up, and tab out to your second game while they play patty cake with RNGesus. So it isn't like it really makes a difference how many I make. The optimal progression arc already encourages people to interact with the game as little as possible, after all. Not very controversial opinion here, but I strongly believe that the cyclotron is a multi-block that has no reason to exist. It has, optimistically, maybe 5 recipes that I will ever use, and as far as I can tell, the only purpose of all 5 of them is to gate progression behind a really slow thing, which forces you to make a lot of them and give them lots of energy, and I guess this is supposed to be a challenge, or a surprise, or something? Like, come on, people, your progression mechanics are the literal pictorial dictionary definition of a one-trick pony. How can you possibly think anyone who gets to this point in the game is going to somehow be dumb enough to not have a massively overbuilt production economy explicitly to pass these nonsense resource checks? Like, you have a good thing going, New Horizons, so I am begging you, stop bloating it up with all of this blatantly useless bull. Speaking of blatantly useless bullshit, I have a mousepad merch deal. It is going to be ending on February 16th, so if you've been on the fence, that is your deadline if you want to get one. Back to the game. So anyway, I let my game run for like 20 hours again, and now I have 26 quantum anomalies, which is plenty. So let's move on from this. Now that I am the proud owner of a small handful of extremely expensive rainbow marbles, I'm able to craft up a couple of energy sinks, also known as matter fabrication multi-blocks. The first one is set to recycler mode and is very carefully throttled to keep my ME system from permanently locking itself into a scrap ball, and it is fed off of a generous assortment of dead squids, ink sacs, and Bibliocraft framing boards, which I selected because I can craft them in batches of 131,000 in about 5 seconds. The scrap from the first one is fed to the second one, where some jiggery pokery forces it to switch between crafting UUA from the scrap and then UU matter from the UUA that it has buffered up in the meantime. It scales arbitrarily by eating more power, so the only other interaction that will ever be necessary for either of these machines is upgrading the energy hatch. Woo. Gameplay. For all my facetiousness, the next problem I have is quite interesting from an engineering standpoint. There is a component to wetware processors called a neuroprocessing unit. It takes 15 seconds to craft one of them on UV voltage. Now, I could just design a passive production assembly line for them, which would have the dual benefits of being really simple and, if you follow my naming conventions, having the world's best nickname according to potty-mouthed children everywhere. But I got bored, so I decided that I wanted to give the advanced assembly line a try. In addition to its spoken shorthand being an excellent description of the past 3 tiers of this mod pack, its quirk is that it produces each item stack in parallel like an actual assembly line would. So a 4-item stack craft would be assembled 4 times faster with 4 times the power, a 12-item stack 12 times, you get the idea. This changes how item delivery works to make my existing, and blatantly plagiarized, design not work, because you have to keep supplying items while the machine is running to take advantage of its advanced behavior, which is where the fun comes in, because now I have to make a new one. The solution the wiki recommends is to use a similar design as before, but add in some AE2 subnet jankery so the item buses can effectively hold an infinite amount of one item, and the system won't add any more until its first batch is used up. It's a cool idea, and it's really elegant, but it's not the option I'm going with. Real-time, in-flight, sorted, in-order item delivery sounds complicated. And it is, until you realize that there is a simple, cheap, purpose-built solution to all of those problems. It's called the stocking input bus, and I've been using them since IV. The advanced assembly line may jam on out-of-order inputs from regular input buses, but for some reason it doesn't have any problems whatsoever using stocking buses configured to stock the relevant items, even if those items are visually out of order in the interface. All you need to do is configure each AAL stocking bus with items of any of the recipes that may need that item in that slice, link it to the ME system in charge of storing them, and then tie that subnet to the auto-crafting interface like in the original design. Fluid selection behavior is a bit weird because it isn't smart enough to use fluids from a multi-fluid import option like a stocking bus unless the fluid is in the first slot of the bus, but that doesn't matter because auto-crafting with regular fluid input hatches is a solved problem that you can copy over wholesale without changing anything. This setup has some major advantages. It works for both kinds of assembly line, is cheaper, and is easier to wire up and debug than the wiki design. It doesn't have any quirks to its requirements like the wiki design does, and it doesn't give a single solitary fart about duplicated non-full item stacks. The major trade-off is that it's impossible to put more than 16 recipes on the line at a time, because stocking input buses only have 16 slots, but, hear me out here, on the whole, I don't think there's really that much of a sacrifice here, at least not until the super late game. There are roughly 400 assembly line recipes in this version of New Horizons. Of those, 72 are components and would eventually be migrated over to a multi-block creatively called a component assembly line for cost-saving reasons, or they're just straight up unused. A whole swath of other recipes are devoted to things that are kind of just useless or will be phased out in each tier, and some of the items are straight up not part of the game yet. If you eliminate all those, what remains is a substantially reduced pool of relevant items, many of which I will never be manufacturing in bulk, and given how set this game was on demanding multi-block spam just a minute ago, making a dozen AALs to save myself the headache of redoing my wiring for a databank seems like a perfectly acceptable option. With the basic precursors for circuit assembly and the massive data dump done, I now begin the glorious task of producing precisely one wetware circuit. I would say the gameplay is riveting if we hadn't eclipsed rivets as a building component 5 tiers ago. I then get to slice that circuit up into itty-bitty pieces, add mystery items, throw the result in a freshly built circuit assembler, which, oh by the way, we need 3 of those, and repeat the process 2 more times to get myself the wetware processors and wetware supercomputer production lines done. And there we stop, because New Horizons decided to change things up and introduced a fun new mechanic called the final tier of your circuits have to be made in an assembly line now, you nerd. No problem, I already have one of those ready and raring to go, so I will just research the recipe and that's odd. The research doesn't have a scanner recipe, it uses something called a research station instead. I bet this is going to be a well thought out, player-friendly designed choice. Yeah, so big shocker, the research station is a multi-block version of the scanner. For literary structure's sake, I would dearly love to say its quirk is the very original and not at all overused trope of, what if we made every recipe take 3 hours to complete because I can't tell the difference between meaningful challenge and time wasting, and I want the people who play my mod to think I'm super cool. But I'm actually going to give this thing a pass for now, because someone clearly spent time and effort to make getting one of these working more involved than the usual just plug the vacuum cleaner into the sun school of stupid energy management that I'm used to working with. The research station itself is your bog standard multi. Stuff plus energy goes in, and stuff and the shattered remains of your industrial energy complex comes out. The fun part is making one of the things that goes in, called computation, which is produced by a second multi-block called a quantum computer. The quantum computer, whose name is a massive misnomer by the way, there is precisely nothing about this build that implies it performs qubit operations, and in my world we just call this a server farm. Anyway, the quantum computer's whole deal is that it eats a buttload of power and transforms that power into a dubiously useful virtual resource called compute. It's basically just a crypto miner, folks. We are doing cutting-edge R&D with the power of flipping Dogecoin. Power goes in the computer the normal way, and Dogecoin gets fed from the rig to the scanner using a copy-pasted version of the laser power paradigm, only this time we call it optical data something or other. I won't bother explaining it, because if you know how to wire the lasers, you know how to wire this one. The twist comes with how the rig converts electricity into stupid currency, because it steals some of the basic ideas from how IC2 reactors work. The computer multi holds a bunch of blocks called computer racks. In those racks, you can put a combination of various advanced circuit things and heat dissipating items to farm bitcoins and contribute to the global warming epidemic, respectively. More circuits equals more funny money and more heat. More overclocking and more power, as configured by the controller, equals more compute and more heat, and too much heat turns your server farm into a do-it-yourself ventilation chasm. Yeah, it blows up if you mess with it too much. Just use the calculator linked in the wiki or the pre-built layouts and you will be fine. It's not as robust as Industrial Craft's system, which is probably for the best, considering that the target audience would optimize it to oblivion in about 5 minutes flat, but the end result is that its obvious actual effort was put into making it not just a lame progress box, and it's kind of a breath of fresh air, in so much as that is possible given the whole living in a death factory situation. The less fun part is getting them working. In addition to maintenance, Bitcoin miners require you to complete a really obnoxious minigame in a block called an uncertainty resolver before the machine can start working. I like the idea in principle, but its implementation might as well be a giant middle finger to people with vision impairments, bad frame rate, or lousy lighting conditions. I have none of these problems, and I still can't reliably differentiate the coloration and flicker rate of the puzzle pieces, and according to the wiki page for this thing, this is such a common problem that the best strategy is to just randomly move pieces until you luck into the correct arrangement. Still, kinda cool. Through the power of trial, error, and severe ocular trauma, I get the puzzle solved, and my base is now furnished with a functioning combination research lab and environmental hazard waiting to happen. And that's gonna be all for today, folks. Thank you for your time. Mousepads are going to be a thing for a little bit longer, so get them while they last. Oxygen Not Included seems to have been the clear winner for the next series, so the next episode of that will be out next week, and as always, I hope you enjoyed.